Welcome to 21st Sports Recap and Reaction for the Seattle Seahawks at the Minnesota Vikings in their NFC Wild Card playoff game played January 10th, 2016. This is the second time these two teams faced off, as they had faced each other back in Week 13, where the Seahawks won 38-7. Of course, that would not be the case in this game. It would be much closer, and we're actually going to go over every possession. We're also going to look at the stats, and we're going to give our breakdown and analysis. So to start off in this game, the Vikings would get the ball first, and they were actually able to eat up a decent amount of game clock. On their first possession, they had the ball for 7 minutes, but after 11 plays, they would end up punting the ball on 4th and 3 from the Seattle 45, and that was after Peterson failed to pick up a first down on a 3rd and 1, as he had lost a couple yards. So the Vikings would end up punting after their first possession, and now the Seahawks would get the ball with about 8 minutes still left in the first, and a crazy play would ensue on special teams as they went 3 and out. And on 4th down, on the punt, it was a botched snap, and they ended up not going for the punt, and we saw a fumble. It was recovered by Seattle, but they ended up being down as they do not pick up the first down, and they do not get the punt off, and so now Minnesota would take over on the Seattle 29. So already in field goal range to start this possession, the second possession for the Vikings in this game, as there was just about 7 minutes left still in the first. And this time Peterson picked up 2 on a 3rd and 1 as he would convert for the first down. But then on 3rd and 5 from the Seattle 13, it was Bridgewater to Diggs for 6 yards to make it 1st and goal at the 7, but they weren't able to get it into the end zone. And so out came Blair Walsh to kick a 22-yard field goal with just over a minute left in the first quarter, and it was 3-0 Minnesota over Seattle. So that was the first points on the board. The Seahawks would now bring the first quarter to a close on their next possession. They actually would end up picking up a couple first downs, but then their drive would stall at the 46, their own 46, as they would punt on 4th and 2 with about 12 minutes left before halftime. So now the Vikings would get the ball. The Seahawks would hold them, though, to a 3 and out. Earl Thomas made a big play on 3rd and 4 that would break up a pass to McKinnon that may have been a touchdown if Thomas hadn't been there to break that one up. So now the Seahawks would get the ball after the punt, and on the first play, Wilson airs it out to Baldwin. He picks up 22 yards and a first down, as they were now in Minnesota territory, having started off on their own 39. Now they're on the Minnesota 39. Then on a 2nd and 9, Russell Wilson scrambles for 11 yards and a first down at the Minnesota 27. But then on 3rd and 11, a delay a game penalty would make it 3rd and 16. And so they would end up with a 4th and 13 after only picking up 3 yards on 3rd down, and they would elect to go for it. So they go for it on 3rd and 13 at the Minnesota 30 instead of electing to go for a field goal, which would have been a 47-yard field goal attempt. So they go for it, they pick up 7 yards, but they're 6 shy of the first down as they would turn the ball over on downs. So now the Vikings would respond with a couple of quick first downs, but then they would end up having to punt the ball as the Seahawks shut down the run, and they forced them into a 3rd and 13, and on 4th and 9, the Minnesota Vikings punted to Seattle, who would now take over with less than 3 minutes left in the first half, and with the ball on their own 14-yard line. So we end up with a pass interference call on a 3rd and 5 coming out of the 2-minute warning, and that was called against Rhodes as he was covering a Lockett, and now that would result in a 41-yard play for the Seahawks, and that made it a first down in Minnesota territory at the 40, but the drive would stall at the 38 as Harrison Smith almost intercepted Russell Wilson on 3rd and 8, but instead it would be a punt, And now the Vikings would get the ball with over a minute left to play, but instead of trying to make something happen before the half, they took 2 knees. So they took 2 knees to go into the locker room up 3-0. And right there, that showed me that they were a little bit scared of that defense of Seattle, that they didn't want to test them. They had a minute left. And usually, you see a team take a knee when there's like 30 seconds left. But with a minute left, they did not want to risk the possible turnover. And so we went to halftime. And now the Seahawks would end up with the ball first coming out of the half. And on the very first play from scrimmage in the second half, Russell Wilson about to be sacked by Robeson, and he pushes the ball forward, but the ball was ruled down, and they said no penalty for grounding, but the fans were booing. A little bit questionable there if that was really a pass attempt, but they did rule that it was. So they ended up with a 3rd and 10 2 plays later, and Doug Baldwin made a spectacular one-handed catch for a first down. Then on a 2nd and 6, Wilson airs it out to Lockett, but Trey Waynes makes a big play to break up the pass, and what would have been a first down in the red zone right there near the goal line. It would have been 1st and goal, but Trey Waynes with a huge play right there. So then on 3rd and 6, Fred Jackson ends up picking up a first down coming out of the flat, and then Christian Michael picks up 9 yards on the next play, but the Vikings stuff the run on 2nd down, and on 3rd and 1, they stop Michael in the backfield, and so it was 4th and 3, and they almost end up with a delay of game, but they end up calling a timeout, and ironically, crowd noise might have been the reason why they had to burn that timeout right there. So now coming out of the timeout, Wilson was looking for Baldwin, and the pass goes off of his fingertips, and it's intercepted by Trey Waynes. So Trey Waynes coming up with some big plays on defense on the first possession of the second half. It ends up being a turnover as Minnesota would now take over at midfield on their own 46. And then on the first play, Bridgewater goes to Zach Lyon. He picks up 11. And then a roughing the passer penalty against Averill would tack on another 15. So now it's a first down for the Vikings on the Seattle 28-yard line. But then Peterson gets stuffed in the backfield on 2nd and 7 to make it 3rd and 14. A pass for 6 yards to McKinnon would not pick up the first down. So on 4th and 8 from the 26, Blair Walsh came out to attempt a 43-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and it was now 6-0 Minnesota. So now on the next possession, we see Everson Griffin getting a sack on Russell Wilson on the very first play from scrimmage from the 1st and 10 on the 20. And then a sack by Sharif Floyd on the very next play, back-to-back sacks, sending up 3rd and 23. Michael picked up 13 yards, but out would come the punting unit on 4th and 10. So the Vikings coming up with a big stop there, forcing the 3 and out and the punt. And now they would take over in Seattle territory with the ball on the 48 after the punt. So now they would end up getting down close into field goal range as you ended up with a flag against Seattle. They ended up with a first down. And actually there was a flag on the punt that added on some yards, is why they were on the 48. And then a flag on 2nd down against Richard Sherman for pass interference. And then Stephon Diggs would end up converting on a 3rd and 2 as he picked up the first down. But then the Seahawks were able to clamp down, and they ended up stopping the Vikings from converting on a 3rd and 6 as Cliff Averill sacks Bridgewater, and out came Blair Walsh to attempt a 47-yard field goal. It was good, and it was now 9-0 Minnesota over Seattle with just seconds left in the third, as the kickoff would end up with, after the kickoff, one play by the Seahawks would end up bringing the third quarter to a close, and that was a pass from Wilson to Smith that picked up 14 yards. So now to open up the fourth quarter, the Seahawks were on their own 34, and then you end up with a pass interference call against Munnerlyn. Waynes actually looked to be injured on the play, and it would be a first down for the Seahawks at the 39. Then on 3rd and 2, Russell Wilson goes to Michael. He picks up 14 yards, and it was a first down in Minnesota territory at the Minnesota 39. So now on this play, this was crazy. On this next play, Russell Wilson has the snap go over his left shoulder. It's a fumble. Wilson scoops it up. He's scrambling around. A broken play. He finds Tyler Lockett. He picks up 35 yards. And now it's 1st and goal on the 4. So what an amazing play. That's what Wilson is known for. And then on 2nd and goal from the 3, Russell Wilson to Doug Baldwin, a 3-yard touchdown. As the Seahawks finally get on the scoreboard, Hauschka adds the extra point, and it was now a 2-point game with the score Minnesota 9, Seattle 7. So now Minnesota would get the ball, and on 2nd and 5 from the 27, a dump off to Peterson, and Kam Chancellor strips the ball, and it's recovered by Rubin. So a fumble by Peterson, and now the Seahawks had the ball in Minnesota territory at the 40. Then on 3rd and 7 from the 37, Russell Wilson to Curse. He picks up 8 yards, and it's the first down at the Minnesota 29. But the defense holds, and out would come Hauschka to attempt a 46-yard field goal on 4th and 9 from the 28. It was up, it was good, and now the Seahawks were in the lead for the first time in this game with the score 10-9 with just over 8 minutes left in the 4th. Of course, that field goal was the result of the fumble by Peterson. So now the Vikings would get the ball after the kickoff. They had it on their own 32, but on 2nd and 9, Bobby Wagner sacks Teddy Bridgewater, and that made it 3rd and 18. They would pick up 13 with a dump off to Asiata on 3rd down, but on 4th and 5, they would be forced to punt from the 37 as they would go 3 and out on the possession. So now Seattle would take over on their own 31 after the punt, but they would end up going 3 and out. They had a 3 and 1, and Sendejo almost picks off Wilson, but it's an incomplete pass, and so out came the punting unit as they also went 3 and out on the possession. And so now Minnesota would take over, and they had the ball on their own 19 after the punt. 2nd and 3 from the 26, McKinnon picks up 6 yards and a first down at the 32. But then on 2nd and 10, Bridgewater sacked by Bruce Irvin and KJ Wright, and that brought up 3rd and 16 from the 26, and an incomplete pass broken up by Jeremy Lane as he made an incredible play to make it a punt, as they would end up having a punt after 5 plays on the possession. And so now the Seahawks would get the ball back on their own 25 after the punt, but they would end up going 3 and out on the possession, as they would actually bring this game to the 2-minute warning, and they would end up punting coming out of the 2-minute warning, as Fred Jackson had one come in and out of his hands on a 3rd and 5, and so it ended up with the punt, and now Minnesota would end up taking over on their own 39 after the punt. But then on 2nd and 10 from the 39, with about a minute and a half left in this game, a penalty against Kam Chancellor for pass interference, even though it looked to me like it was offensive pass interference, as Rudolph had pushed Chancellor to the ground, but the refs call it defensive pass interference, and so it's a first down for the Vikings in Seattle territory at the 42. And on the very next play, Kyle Rudolph picks up 24 yards as he makes a nice play, especially yards after the catch. And now it was a first down in the red zone at the Seattle 18-yard line. Peterson gets stopped for a couple of yards, and then he picks up 4, which would set up 3rd and 4 on the 12. Now he picks up 3 yards, so now it's 4th and 1 as he was stopped just shy of the first down. And so with less than half a minute left in this game, Blair Walsh would come out to attempt a 27-yard field goal, as it was a chip shot, but it's no good. He misses the field goal wide left, and now all that was left to do was for Russell Wilson to take a knee in the victory formation as the Seattle Seahawks pull off the win the come-from-behind victory to win by 1 point on the road in Minnesota. What a crazy game. And the refs almost hand this one to Minnesota there with that pass interference call, which would bring them into Seattle territory. Of course, Rudolph did make a nice big play on the next play to pick up 24 to bring them into the red zone. And then they get down there all the way to the 9-yard line for that chip shot, but they were not able to convert on that field goal as it was no good. And Seattle is moving on. They're going to be going to Carolina to face the Panthers in the divisional round of the playoffs. So it was a crazy game. It was cold. It was very, very, very cold. They kept showing this guy in the stands with a beard with icicles on his beard. That's how cold it was. It was below zero. I think it was 6 below zero. And with the wind chill factor, it was something like negative 21 is what it felt like. But let's look at the stats in this game. Russell Wilson, he didn't have a lot of yards, but he came through in the clutch, especially on that broken play, as he's known to do. But he was 13 for 26, 142 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He also had 21 yards on the ground. Christian Michael was the leading rusher in this game, 21 carries for 70 yards. He also had 1 reception for 14 yards, giving him 84 total yards in the game. And Doug Baldwin, 5 catches for 42 yards and a touchdown. Tyler Lockett, just 1 catch, that 35-yard reception that would set up the Seahawks down on the 4-yard line on that broken play. It's his 1 catch. He got it when they needed it the most. It counted more than if he had 10 catches. But Teddy Bridgewater for the Vikings, 17 for 24, 146 passing yards. He did a good job protecting the ball. No touchdowns, no interceptions. But Adrian Peterson, 23 carries for just 45 yards, averaging less than 2 yards per carry as he was shut down once again by the Seattle Seahawks defense. They had held him to just 18 yards the first time around when they met in the regular season. Here he ends up more than doubling that output, but he ends up with 45 yards on the ground and 13 yards off of 2 receptions, giving him 58 total yards in the game. And Stephon Diggs, 4 receptions for 26 yards. And Kyle Rudolph, he had just 1 reception for 24 yards. Of course, that would put them in the red zone there down the stretch on that final possession, but they were not able to turn that into any points. And Jerick McKinnon, 3 catches for 22 yards. He also had 2 rushes for 7 yards. So he ended up with 29 yards on the game. And for the kickers, Steven Hauschka was perfect, 1 for 1 on the field goals, 1 for 1 on the extra points. And that ended up being the difference. And Blair Walsh, 3 for 4 on the field goals. Did not attempt an extra point. They weren't able to get into the end zone. And he misses the game winner from just 27 yards out. And for the defense for Seattle, Bobby Wagner had a sack. Cliff Averill had a sack. KJ Wright and Bruce Irvin each had a half a sack. Kam Chancellor had a forced fumble. And then for Minnesota, Everson Griffin had a sack. So did Sharif Floyd. Trey Waynes with the game's only interception. And we look at the team stats. 14 first downs for the Vikings. 13 first downs for the Seahawks. And on third down, the Seahawks were 5 for 14, 35% conversion rate, and the Vikings 3 for 13, just 23% on third down. And on fourth down, Seattle went for it 3 times, was not able to convert. They had turned the ball over 3 times in this game. The Vikings went for it once on fourth down, and they did convert. We look at total net yards, 226 for Seattle, 183 for Minnesota. And on the ground, the Seahawks netted 97 yards, and the Vikings netted just 58 yards on the ground as they averaged, as a team, 2 yards per rushing play. Seattle averaged 3.5. We look at the total net pass yards, 129 for the Seahawks. Russell Wilson was sacked twice, losing a total of 13 yards. And for the Vikings, they netted 125 through the air. Bridgewater was sacked 3 times, losing a total of 21 yards. We look at the penalties in this game. Not very many penalties. 6 penalties against the Seahawks for 65 yards. 2 penalties against the Vikings for 46 yards. Seattle had 2 fumbles in this game, but they were able to recover. They were able to recover both of their fumbles, and the Vikings had 1 fumble. That was by Peterson. That would cost them the game, as that would end up leading to the go-ahead field goal, the only field goal by Seattle in this game, and that made it 10-9. When we look at the red zone, the Seahawks 1 for 1. They only made 1 trip to the red zone. That, of course, was set up by that 35-yard catch by Lockett, his only catch of the game. And for the Vikings, they were 0 for 2 in the red zone, as the Seattle Seahawks defense turned the red zone into the dead zone. And then the time of possession actually was in favor of Minnesota, 32 minutes, 26 seconds versus 27 minutes, 34 seconds for Seattle. So this is a low-scoring defensive battle. It actually ended up going pretty much the way that I thought it would go. The first time around, the Seahawks dominated the game. This time I thought it'd be closer. I thought it would be 13-6, as I thought the Vikings would end up with 2 field goals and that the Seahawks would have 1 touchdown and 2 field goals. But instead, the Vikings end up with 3 field goals and Seattle just 1 touchdown and 1 field goal. Basically, I thought the difference would be that Seattle would end up with 1 trip to the end zone, whereas the Vikings, I didn't see them getting into the end zone against the Seattle Seahawks defense. And that's primarily how the game ended up going. Of course, they had a crazy finish once again. The refs having some involvement in it anyway. Not as much per se as the night, last night with the Bengals and the Steelers with the 2 penalties for 30 yards in that game. Just had the 1 pass interference call down the stretch. And of course, they still were out of field goal range at that point. So, it wasn't as big of an effect on the game, but still in the final 2 minutes, I don't know, some questionable calls by the referees, in my opinions. Still, the Vikings, they made a big play on the very next play. Rudolph comes up with that big 24-yard reception, his only reception of the game, and then they get down there into field goal range. But Blair Walsh, inexplicably, he ends up missing that field goal. And so you had some, influence by the referees in the outcome, but not quite so much, as it, of course, came down to Blair Walsh missing that field goal. A very unlikely end, as it looked like as if the Vikings were actually going to come away with the victory. But instead, the Seattle Seahawks are moving on to Carolina. So what a crazy game. And Russell Wilson, I'll tell you, Kam Newton had such a big season, but Russell Wilson's right there in the MVP race if you look at the numbers. Although, of course, Seattle didn't have as many wins, but they had, a lot of things that they had to overcome in this season. Struggles early on. They didn't have a full roster, all their guys there. Then even beast mode going down, and them going on to have such a strong second half off the strength of Russell Wilson putting up some huge numbers through the air and on the ground, as he had a big season. And then here in this game, not putting up big numbers per se, but he came up with the big play when they needed it the most. Russell Wilson is the definition of clutch, as he was super clutch when it mattered the most. It came down to that fourth quarter, and he ends up leading them to 10 points in the fourth quarter. Of course, the defense stepping up big time. All game long, the defense was putting in some rough positions. That first field goal they let up was due to that botched punt. And then, they're playing from behind, but they stayed strong. They, were right there holding the Vikings, kept holding them, wouldn't let them into the end zone. Then they forced that fumble. Kam Chancellor stripping Adrian Peterson, and then Hauschka puts them ahead by 1 point, and they hold on to win this one. So a crazy game. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Definitely interested to read your thoughts and opinions. Thank you very much for listening. It is greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day and having a great weekend and enjoying all the sports.